we welcome an author, an historian, and a teacher at Southern Nazarene to our program tonight. John Dwyer is our guest. He's written several books, and his latest is just released. The title is Mustang. It's a World War II novel about American aviators. John, welcome to KLBJ tonight. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Well, it's an honor to be on with you, Kenny, and your listeners, especially on this amazing weekend in America.
Well, I appreciate the chance to maybe tell us a little bit about your new book. It's called Mustang. It's about a character that you've actually written about before. Tell us why his story is so compelling that you wanted to write another book about him.
Well, Kenny, some of your listeners have probably read Shortgrass, the prequel to Mustang. It won the Will Rogers Medallion Award, a national literary contest based in Fort Worth for Western-based literature 2 years ago, and it told the story of a Dust Bowl farm boy, Lance Roark, who grew up during those rough times, became a college football star, had a natural knack for aviation, and of course the late 1930s was just a very vibrant period for the growth of that pursuit in America. And then came Pearl Harbor and World War II. But I think the intriguing thing about it in this case, in Shortgrass, Kenny, was that this young man was a Mennonite, so he came from a pacifist background, and he had this great decision to make whether to carry his talents into the war in a situation where he'd have to, of course, go back on a lot of his teachings of his background. And that led into the current book that, as you said, just came out, Mustang. And I guess that's kind of a tip what his decision was, because he lands in England in the first scene of the book in command of a B-17 Flying Fortress in the height of the European Air War.
Yeah, and this guy's really got a heck of a story, as you mentioned. I think one of the things that I would definitely like you to touch on is the relevance this book has for us today, to the extent that in your book, Mustang, you talk about this guy and others, the 1940s equivalent of post-traumatic stress syndrome. Tell us about that.
Well, Kenny, I think that's something that sets Mustang apart from certainly the typical World War II novel. We look back on that conflict, and it was the greatest or most horrific conflict, the greatest cataclysm in world history. 3% of the world's population died, and of course countless more than that were wounded, maimed, psychologically scarred. And yet those of us that grew up, the sons and daughters of that greatest generation, we didn't hear that much about it. Typically those guys did not talk about it ever, or if they did, it was very late in life. And so what Mustang, I think, in kind of a risky venture in some ways, we take an all-American boy, the hero of Shortgrass, we put him in this brutal European air war. And, I think it's somewhat lost on us when we watch these documentaries, Kenny, of D-Day and Battle of the Bulge and so forth, just how difficult it was to defeat Nazi Germany. I mean, it took 6 years for not just the United States, but much of the Western Hemisphere, France, Europe, the British Empire, Russia, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, countless countries fighting against this one totalitarian empire. And what had to happen for there to be a D-Day, which, as you know, we're getting ready to celebrate the 75th anniversary of it, was to win the fight in the skies over Europe. And that's what the story of Mustang is. And yet it goes a step farther, and it shows the cost on those guys, not just the ones that died, which thousands of our airmen died. We don't realize that either, in the skies, in combat. But the guys that came back, the price that they had to pay in a day when there was not the counseling options, there were not the medications, there was not the treatment that we have nowadays. And it was a very difficult situation, and I think it's something that I want to make sure that in Mustang our readers either remember or maybe learn for the first time that there was an awful price to pay to win World War II.
I want to come back to your book, Mustang, in just a moment, but I want to give you a chance, John, to also talk about at your school, Southern Nazarene University, the Centers of Excellence for Veteran Student Success. Tell us about that briefly, please.
Sure. Well, Kenny, that's Southern Nazarene in Oklahoma City was one of only 13 colleges that was one of those original centers for veteran student success when the United States Department of Education set it up. And so our school has a history of going back quite a few years now of strongly focusing on recruiting veterans, on working with them in a personalized way to help them to form the trajectory of a successful future for them. And I have to tell you, Kenny, on a personal level, having taught there almost 15 years now, I've taught hundreds of veterans that have been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it has been an education for me that I never dreamed I would have when I started teaching at SNU. And it wasn't until I finished writing Mustang that I realized that all those veterans that I've taught through these many years and the many conversations I've had with them outside of class, hearing stories, laughing and crying with them, hearing heartbreaking stories about things that have happened since they got back to America, those young men and women helped write Mustang because there was no way I could have entered into the challenge of post-traumatic stress disorder and related maladies of our World War II veterans if I had not seen and heard and kind of lived with the veterans that I taught at SNU. So it's amazing how sometimes things work out a lot differently than we plan.
Yeah, you bet. Our guest is John Dwyer. He's the author of a new book that we're talking about, a novel about World War II aviators. The title is Mustang. I want to come back to the book a little bit, John, because when you started our discussion, you mentioned that your lead character was involved in one of the big bombers, and then as the book goes along and this new P-51 Mustangs, right? Those planes came out really within the last couple of years of the war, correct?
Well, that's exactly right, Kenny. And some of your listeners that are World War II aviation aficionados know that the United States Army Air Corps and certainly the Allied countries thought that if we built enough bombers and put enough guns on them, that we could just kind of overpower the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, kind of like if you get an offensive line in a football game that is muscled up enough and has the horsepower, they can just steamroll the defense. Well, again, it's not often necessarily taught or remembered, but it didn't happen. There was one particular air raid that those B-17s made where, in fact, there were more than one. There were several where anywhere from 35 to 40% of the entire force that went on the mission was destroyed. And, you do the math and you realize, well, after a couple of missions, that entire air group would be gone. And you can't win a war like that with those kinds of losses, losing hundreds and hundreds of men on one mission. So the P-51 Mustang came in on a historic scale in that it was the aircraft that was able to, the first one, none before had been able to do it, was able to escort and accompany our bombers from England as far as they needed to go, all the way across Europe, France, Holland, Germany. They were able to go with them and fight those just merciless German fighter planes and keep them off the backs of our bombers so that they could do their job and then get back home safely. So the P-51 Mustang not only did that, but it was the greatest, fighting aircraft fighter up to that point in history. So it could take on all comers, and it's not an exaggeration to say that the P-51 Mustang played a key role in helping us win the air war over Europe, which then cleared the skies of the German Air Force's dominance and then allowed us to hit those beaches at Normandy and Omaha Beach that we're getting ready to celebrate. so that Patton and Montgomery and the others could fight their way across Europe and liberate it.
Yeah, right. As we wrap up with John Dwyer talking about his book Mustang, as we're talking about that plane, I was talking to a Vietnam War vet. He flew hundreds of combat missions, a guy from church, and said it's amazing that many of those Mustangs are still around today in good flying condition, and they were made, I guess, well into the 50s. Is that right?
Well, that's right, Kenny. In fact, there were, a number of nations that used the P-51 Mustang as fighter planes, even prime fighter planes, for 10, even 15 years after World War II. They had Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, these super turbochargers that just gave them an extra gear that they could unleash in combat or when they were rising to altitude. So the P-51 Mustang, in so many ways, I think is just an embodiment of American determination, of American audacity, of American brilliance, and ultimately of American bravery and courage, because that's exactly what it took as we tell the story in the book Mustang. It took courage for these guys to win that air war in Europe. And it took not just courage, but it took guys willing to pay whatever price was necessary for victory. And, of course, a lot of them didn't come back, as we talk about in the book, and a lot of them came back, and they had problems that our veterans today have, but we just didn't know it when we were growing up because they kept it to themselves, and many of them suffered in silence or in privacy. And I want our people, as we celebrate another holiday this weekend, to know that, just be reminded that freedom's not free. We have a lot of opportunities and privileges and comforts that others that gave up their futures so that we could have the one that we enjoy now.
Yeah, you bet. Well said, and I can't top that. Let's, as we have to cut it off here, John, tell our listeners how they can find your book. All the regular outlets, I suppose?
Yes, sir. Barnes & Noble, Amazon, your local bookstores. You can get it online. Just click any of those places you go to. It's called Mustang. And, if you like to shop at a brick-and-mortar bookstore, we love that too. Barnes & Noble or independent stores, if they don't have it in stock, they can get it for you quickly.
The book is Mustang. The author is John Dwyer, our guest this evening on KLBJ. Again, John, thank you so much for your time this evening, and we wish you continued success.
Thank you, and thanks for lifting up our patriots, past, present, and future, Kenny.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. John Dwyer with us on News Radio KLBJ.